Okay, I'm back. Slaves in America would have been slaves in Africa anyway. Summary. Based on the fact that 41% of all blacks in West and Central Africa prior to European conquest were slaves, the extreme increase in price of slaves from the relatively small increase in demand that the Atlantic slave trade represented, and the anecdotal evidence that more slaves were put to work within Africa following Britain's global ban on slavery, we can say the Europeans did not cause a single black person to be a slave who wasn't already going to be one. Populations of West and Central Africa, 1500 to 1800. Population data on West and Central Africa. So West Africa in 1907, 33.385 million. Central Africa in 1907, 12.81 million. In West Africa by 1950, increased population to 70.45 million. And Central Africa increased in 1950 to 26.38 million. Population estimates for West Africa, Central Africa's population inferenced as a proportion of West Africa population estimate based on the trend from 1907 to 1950. Well, this shows population increase from the years 1500 to 1800. So, for example, West Africa's population increased by 5 million over 300 years. And Central Africa's population increased by about 2.5 million over 300 years. Some population estimates that will be used later based on the above extrapolations. So this goes all the way from West Africa from 1525 all the way to 1805. And like I said, the population increased about 5 million. And South Africa, or Central Africa, excuse me, is from 1525 to 1805. You see an increase of about 2.5 million. So the populations of West and Central Africa as a region average around 31.83 million from 1500 to 1800. Central Africa is defined as Chad, Cameroon, Central African Republic, Congo, Kashia, Congo, Brazzaville, Angola, Equatorial Guinea, and Gabon, excuse me. West Africa is defined as Nigeria, Niger, Benton, Togo, Ghana, Ivory Coast, Banku Faso, Mali, Libya, Sierra Leone, Guinea-Bissau, Senegal, Gambia, and Mauritania. The proportions of slaves in West and Central Africa. Encyclopedia Britannica's Guide to Black History, Slavery, claims for the proportion of slaves in various African states. Let's see, Sakto, Guinea and Cameroon, throughout the 19th century, about half population. Fugali Jihad states, all of West Africa, north of the coast, from 1750 to 1900, one half. Ghana, modern day Ghana, 1076 to 1600, one third. Mali, 1200 to 1200 to 1500, about a third. Sengo, which is also modern day Mali, 1720 to 1861, one third. Songhai, which is Mali and Niger, 1464 to 1720, about a third. Kidal, which is modern day Benin, throughout the 19th century, half their population was slaves. Kamabor, which is Chad, Nigeria, Libya, Cameroon, Sudan, Central African Republic, and Algeria, is from 1580 to 1990, one third to 40% of their population. I wanted to make a note on this part because I actually disagree with this. In in 2017, there was a report that showed like footage of slaves being sold at an open market in Libya. So Libya still has slavery. And also in this 2025 article, somewhere down here, yeah, there's a 2021 report, and in it they kind of list the places that are the most popular slave places in the area here. Global Slavery Index in 2021, Libya was ranked 59th globally and 11th in Africa in modern slavery. 47,000 people. So it's no longer, 40% to one third of their population, right? But it's still tens of thousands of people, right? And we'd be hearing a lot about this if it was in a white country. So it says second thing, but also it said that this one, Mauritania and South Sudan, the highest rates of slavery were found. Like, so so this isn't true. Slavery is still ongoing in these places. Maybe just not at the same level that it was. That's your Spencer McGreal special. Thank you for tuning in. Barbary Tego, the Segal region until 1975. Wow, 15% to perhaps 75% of their population. Sengi Gambata, Segal and Gambra, 1300 to 1900, 1/3. Sierra Leone throughout the 19th century, 1/2. Yoruba, modern day Benin and Togo, 1/3. It was all throughout the 19th century. Ashanti, modern day Ghana, 19th century, 1/3 of their population. Dougal, modern day Cameroon, 1/2. Igbo, modern day Niger, throughout the 19th century, 1/2. Congo, modern day Congo, throughout the 19th century, 1/2. And Chokowi, which is modern day Angola, throughout the 19th century, 1/2 of their population was slaves. If the estimates for proportions of the populations that are slaves are taken as precise, it averages to about 41.61%. If these numbers seem extreme, remember that Athens, which was said to be about 1/3 slaves, and the whole of the Confederate States of America was approximately 1/3 slaves. These are not outrageous numbers for slave societies. The number of slaves in West and Central Africa. So we have a good idea of what the population of West and Central Africa was. And we have a consistent subject estimates for the proportion of people that were slaves. The next question is how many people were alive in West and Central Africa from 1500 to 1800? The average age of childbirth in African countries today is around 27. So if we assume the average age of motherhood was 25 back in 1850, 1500 to 1800, then we have a generational time of 25 years. If the average life expectancy was 50 years, then there was roughly 190.98 million people who lived in West and Central Africa from 1500 to 1800. If 41.61 were slaves, that would give us a 79.45 million slaves within West and Central Africa between 1500 and 1800. Even that seems low. Using the above data, we can also say that there were roughly 242.32 million people who lived in Africa from 1525 to 1866. Of those, roughly 100.82 million were slaves. That makes sense. Global slave context. Roughly 12.5 million slaves landed in the United States between 1525 and 1866 to the Americas. Given that 11.9% of slaves died over the Middle Passage, this amounts to 14.22 million slaves having disembarked from Africa to the Americas. Over that same period, we have expected there to have been 242.32 million people to have lived in Africa, and around 100.82 million would have been slaves between 1525 and 1866. In addition, from 1500 to 1800, there were approximately 22 million slaves sold from Africa to the rest of the world, primarily the Middle East and India. While the exact same year as 1525 to 1866, we can presume that between 1525 and 1866, roughly 25 million African slaves were sold to the rest of the world based on the annual rates of slavery from 1500 to 1800. So, based on the size of the total African slave trade within Africa, the Atlantic, and the rest of the world, from 1525 to 1866 was around 140.04 million. The Atlantic slave trade total was 14.22 million, and about 10%, 10.15% of the total African slave trade at this time. Remember, that's also the South America, which had a lot more slaves than North. The inelasticity of supply. Elasticity of supply is simply a fancy way of saying, does quantity supplied increase in response to increase in demand? For slaves, the supply is elastic, which means the supplier of slaves can is elastic, which means the supplier of slaves can easily supply more slaves as demand goes up. If it is inelastic, it means the supplier can't easily get more slaves just because more people are willing to buy them. If the supply is inelastic, then any increase in demand will simply result in the price of slaves increasing. For example, if the supply of slaves was totally fixed and could not be increased, then new buyers would simply outbid some of the previous buyers for whom slaves are now too expensive. This would mean that the arrival of European slave buyers would not increase the number of slaves, but would merely increase their numbers. So they'd be buying the slaves and taking away from someone else. And here we can actually compare the price of slaves in Africa to the number of slave ships to the Americas in the prior 25 years, roughly the generational time. Their price in Africa, the Atlantic slave trade, as a percentage of overall slave trade in Central and West Africa. Prices of slaves in Africa, number of slave ships to the Americas, etc. Estimates. Numbers of slaves in West and Central Africa, the Atlantic slave trade as a proportion of the overall slave trade in West and Central Africa by year. This is why I like him, because I've never seen anyone else do this kind of research. Something that when I watch some of his videos later that we're going to talk about is Ryan Folk kind of talks a lot about people forming arguments and narratives and believing that there's data to support their arguments over there, like in the university, over a hill. They might not have access to it, but they just looked hard enough, it would exist. And I think what I like about him is that he's doing at least the cursory research to kind of show that a lot of these narratives were put in place before the research was done. And we're definitely going to go over that in the next article, which is maybe more shocking than this one. Let me check, make sure we're still recording. We are still recording. Yippee, yippee. Look how fast I'm going. We're almost 13 minutes. Yeah, we can bang this out. We can bang this out. Yeah, bang it out. Okay. So I'll start with the year, 1675. So the price of slaves in Africa is 3.33 pounds. Now, the number of slaves shipped to the Americas in the prior 25 years is 0.488 million. The estimate numbers of slaves in West and Central Africa, 13.48 million. The Atlantic slave trade is a portion of the slave trade in West and Central Africa. It starts at about 3.5%, right? So then we jump to 1776, right? So we're 100 years later. The price of slaves in Africa has increased, right, to 18.43 pounds. The number of slaves shipped to the Americas increased to 1.925 million. The estimated numbers of slaves in West Central Africa increases a little bit, right, to 14.410 million. And the total percentage of the Atlantic slave trade compared to West and Central Africa is now at 11.785%. And then we jump ahead to 1805. The price of slaves increases again to 86 pounds. Is now at 20 million, or sorry, that'd be a lot, 2 million slaves going to America in the prior 25 years. The estimates in slaves in Central Africa and West Africa stays about the same, 14.6 million, and the total and now is a solid 12% for how much the Atlantic slave trade takes up. Now, the extreme increase in the price in response to very small increase in the quantity demands that the Atlantic slave trade represented that the Atlantic slave trade represented, it's evidence that Africans couldn't readily just increase the supply of slaves. There wasn't much or any excess supply to which to supply the Europeans. So they would have had to either sell some of their slaves that they were already using or pick up arms and go try to enslave some people who up to that point had managed to resist enslavement. And that would be pretty hard. Moreover, the price increase are not necessarily entirely caused by the increase in demand over those years. It's impossible to say with any precision what caused the price increase, but the general pattern of extreme price inelasticity with a 8% increase in the relatively quantity demanded coinciding with a 453% increase in the price and then a 0.247 increase in the relatively quantity demand coinciding with a 45% increase in price. Again, there are all sorts of factors that could be at play that I don't know about. However, the limited data that exists points to extreme price inelasticity. And once again, feel free to comment, point me in a different direction, but this is the only article, and this is why I'm finally glad we're getting into this good stuff, that I've ever seen talk about this, ever. And I've been reading articles like this online for decades. So if this research is off or there's something that's a more detailed breakdown, please point me in the direction. Which is evidence of inelasticity of the quantity supplied, which is a long way of saying it looks like the Africans couldn't increase the number of slaves, that the supply was fixed, and as a result, when new buyers came along, the price just shot through the roof. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica article, after limiting and then abolition of the transatlantic slave trade, the number of those African societies put slaves to work in activities such as mining gold, raising peanuts, coconut, palm oils, sesames, and mullet for the market. Of course, that is not data, but merely a subjective impression, being that the end of the Atlantic slave trade did not result in fewer black slaves, they just remained in Africa. And when 40% of the population is enslaved, the people resist with violence being enslaved. It is certainly not difficult to imagine that the supply of slaves was probably quite inelastic. Part 6. Our hands are clean. The life of a slave in the America was certainly better than that of a slave in Africa. It is possible that the average non-slave African had a better life than the average slave in the Americas, but that's not the relative comparison. Let's say that the Atlantic slave trade did not create a single slave, but it merely moved slaves from Africa to the Americas, where they ended up having a better life and a better chance of survival, even taking into account the Middle Passage, which later generations would not have to endure anyway. Yeah, remember, when the Middle Passage, you're talking about once in a lifetime, or once in a, I don't know, it's a one-time occurrence, right? Would they have, what will you then say about the Europeans engaged in a wicked act? Well, yeah, of course. Considering that if the Europeans did not engage in this act, more slaves would have remained in Africa, where they would have been more likely to die, where their lives would have been worse. Still slaves. In this case, the Atlantic slave trade improved their lives relative to being slaves in Africa. Disagree. It's not honestly arguable that the Atlantic slave trade improved the lives of black slaves. It did increase the number of slaves. Well, there's no way of knowing, as the data is too fuzzy. Africa today doesn't have very good records, let alone Africa from 1500. We can speculate that it did, as higher prices for slaves could cause more people to be willing to take the risk involved in acquiring slaves. On the other hand, a higher price of slaves could cause traders and governments to take fewer slaves, as they wouldn't need to take so many. Let me read that again. We can speculate that it did, as higher prices for slaves could cause more people to be willing to take the risk involved in acquiring slaves. On the other hand, a higher price of slaves could cause traders and governments to take fewer slaves. Oh, I see. As they wouldn't need to take so many. So we can speculate that an increase in demand would reduce the number of slaves produced, as well as speculate that it could increase the number of slaves produced. So it could, yeah. As since data is not of high enough resolution to detect whether swinging occurred as a result of the Atlantic slave trade, the point is moot. And everything points to no increase in the number of Africans who were slaves. This is important, at least not to any detectable degree. And if there was a slight increase in blacks and slaves, it's certainly less than the 12.5 million that disembarked, made it to the Americas, and in exchange for those 12.5 million had a better chance of survival. And certainly their progeny had a much better life than those that remained in Africa. Yeah, I agree. We did not cause we. Yeah, we. Like, the guy walking down, like, you're not responsible for the actions of, like, your brother if he assaults somebody. You're responsible for the actions of your ancestors. It's stupid. We did not cause them to be slaves, nor was it our duty to buy their freedom. True. Nobody would be cursing Europeans if nobody cursing Europeans if they did not buy a single slave from Africa. Yet Europeans did not buy a single slave. Those Africans would have been worse off. By doing something that made them better off comparison to inaction, Europeans are condemned as if we caused their enslavement. Oh, they didn't. I think people know that Europeans and Jews weren't going into Africa to capture black people. I don't know if anyone's making that argument. Maybe some dumb people are. I don't know. The Africans were slaves to themselves long before we came along. We did not cause any of it, only bettered their conditions and ensured their eventual freedom. One thing I want to point out too is, remember, I think last video I mentioned that there was like 1 to 2 million whites that were slaves in the Middle East, and people are kind of like, well, where are they now? Well, they're bred into the population or they're castrated, and so they never reproduce. So America is kind of unique in terms of the slaves being sold from Africa to other parts of the world, that they kind of let the slaves reproduce and then their progeny still exist. Whereas in the Middle East, they don't care. They were too busy, raping them and castrating the men. So that's all. Next video will be the real whoopsie daisy. Thank you so much for listening. This has been Spencer McGreal signing off. Bye. Please like and subscribe. Bye. Oh my God.